Greetings and salutations and welcome to this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Before we begin, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and share this video with a friend. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. My guest today is a playwright, theater creator, performer, and producer. His works have been translated into 4 languages and presented in over 60 cities across the world for a wide range of audiences. He was the first general manager of Propel Youth Arts, a youth arts development and advocacy group in Western Australia. He was commissioned by the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres, Playwrights Guild of Canada, and ATFC to write the 2019 World Theatre Day message for Canada. He was awarded the inaugural Joanna Metcalf Performing Arts Prize in 2019 for having a significant impact on performing arts in Ontario, and was a finalist for the K.M. Hunter Theatre Award in 2018. He was awarded the Playwrights Guild of Canada National Comedy Award in 2021 for Every Little Nookie, which had its world premiere at the Stratford Festival in 2022, and his comedy Men Express Their Feelings was described by the Calgary Herald as an instant Canadian classic in 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sonny Drake.
Hello. That was such a mouthful.
It was.
Rewrite all that.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to going on there. I'll tell you, but that's an impressive resume there. So obviously you've got some experience in this. So how did you get your start? What made you start writing plays, and then how did it progress?
I mean, I started writing stuff that I wanted to see on stage. And, you know, growing up I've lived in Canada for the last 12 years, but before that, I grew up in Australia. And despite being in the 3rd largest city in Australia, I wasn't seeing any form of content with trans characters, trans storylines, other than the sort of the punchline, which was generally a trans woman who was tricking a cis man into sex. And so there were no kind of trans stories with any form of substance or nuance. And you know, so that's what I started making work about. And I, in fact, didn't go to theatre school because at the time I would have been cast in women's roles, which I would find fantastic and fun now, but at the time it wouldn't have resonated very well with me as a trans man. And so I just started making theatre. I started making works. Anytime something perplexed me or confused me or I needed to figure it out, it sort of spat out into a performance work. And over the years, I kind of then built a body of work enough that I started to get institutional buy-in to my work. And that's how so really through making work and falling flat on my face and then picking myself up and making more work.
You mentioned that that anything you needed to figure out. Can you remember? Can you have examples of any of those things that you were having problems figuring out that you overcame? Any of those obstacles that you remember specifically? Yeah,
and it's interesting. You know, in my earlier body of work, I made things that were very active for me at the time. So, for example, I made a work about coming out to my family as trans. I made a work about alcohol and substances. And now I find in my kind of later body of work, I tend to more wait for things to have composted a little. I made a lot of art and work that was honestly really difficult to make at the time. And I think there's a real place for that sort of work, and I fully support my peers in deciding to make something that they're in the muck of. But now I sort of, I have so many areas and things that I'm interested in that I tend to wait. If it's, you know, kind of based on something that I'm personally figuring out, I tend to wait for it to compost a little more than, you know, before I work on it.
So are your pieces more performance art? Would they still be considered like a traditionally structured play?
Well, they went from kind of more like performance. I would never say performance art. More like maybe somewhere sort of a fusion of storytelling, puppetry, stop motion animation. That was sort of my and very physical. That was my kind of earlier work. And now I would say I do more like. I don't know that I'd say traditionally structured plays, but more like plays. My obsession is how to get the content of my plays reflected in the form and style of the work. So it means that, each piece of mine tends to be quite different, depending on the content that I'm exploring. So I'll give you an example. So Men Express Their Feelings is really, it's a piece that is revisioning masculinity for the 21st century. And so I've structured it like a hockey game. So I kind of went, okay, hockey and sports being this site of both, hockey is such a fantastic game in so many ways, like the pace and the skill and it's a very sharp and fascinating game. And also hockey culture can be incredibly toxic. And I have similarly complicated feelings about masculinity. There's all these beautiful possibilities and beautiful things about masculinity, and also, a real culture of toxicity as well. So kind of then sort of taking this thing, hockey, which people have, that full range of relationship to, and crafting the work is shaped into 3 periods, and we have characters sort of stepping in and out of the action of the play out into commentating the play, except the play is like a game of emotions. It's not a sports game, but really kind of sort of looking at the ways, and so for example, also we replay different moments as similar to kind of sports action replays, but different emotional moments from different emotional point of views. And I feel like, so then, there are elements there of kind of traditional structure, and then there are also things that are quite different. And that's why, like I said, each of my pieces is quite different. So Climate Change and Other Small Talk is an entirely different beast than that.
Right. So going back to Men Express Their Feelings, are you writing this as you go, or did you sit down, write it out, and then start rehearsal process and then tweak it from there? What was the process of that? Because it's a fascinating concept of kind of structuring it in the form of a hockey game. So did you go in with that? I mean, how did you develop this? What was the developmental process for this?
Often there's sort of like a something that often that like I have a kind of a theme or something, an issue or something I want to make work about that I've been kind of percolating for a lot of years, and then typically there's maybe a thing that happens that kind of just bumps it up on my radar or gives me a particular idea. And so, for example, with Men Express Their Feelings, I was listening to the radio, CBC radio, and the Leafs, the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team there had lost. And for some reason, fans were being interviewed, how do you feel about the loss? And this guy got on and was like, well, I kind of feel like, I sort of feel like, well, I don't know, I kind of feel, well, I just sort of, you just kind of feel like it's when your team loses, you just sort of feel like really kind of bummed. And it was just this epic struggle to get out this one word feeling of bummed. And I just thought there's so much in there. I wondered, was he standing next to his mates? And in fact, he knew exactly and precisely how he felt, but he was like, how's this going to go over? I've got to, kind of almost manufacture an emotional illiteracy here to kind of fit in. Was he actually genuinely just very overcome with emotion and having trouble expressing himself, which is another reason I picked sports as this kind of medium, was because it is often a place where men are allowed to express a wider range of emotions. It's perfectly acceptable. I mean, I grew up in a huge sporting family with 4 older brothers, and it's perfectly acceptable to cry when your team loses. There's very few other circumstances where that's acceptable. It's basically if someone dies or your favorite team loses, you can like have 1 tear. You're allowed to, 1 tear allowance. So, just that sort of struggle that I heard in that one man on the radio kind of was the starting place for my process. And I typically I now usually have the title, the kind of the sort of general kind of style of the piece and what I'm interested in experimenting with in terms of form and structure. a opening scene and a closing scene. That's what I often start with, and then I've just got to fill in the middle.
Nice. I'm going to go off on a slight tangent, only because it's like I'm listening to you tell the story about this gentleman whose team lost. Do the Canadians, do they riot when their teams lose, or even when their teams win, or is that just you guys are really polite and you don't even do that?
I think that probably there's a little bit more politeness than down here, and I mean, Aussies are definitely a little more rowdy. You know, I grew up in a little bit more of a rowdy sports culture than in Canada. Is there a rioting culture here?
Oh yeah, I mean, if a team loses, I mean, there's going to be cars lit on fire, and even if they win, there's going to be cars lit on fire. You know, give or take what city it is. So, but I'm just curious about that. So you write your end. Is that always the case? Do you always write the beginning and the end, and then fill it in the middle? And how do you find that works for you?
I don't necessarily literally write the beginning and the end, but I often have an idea of where it's going to start and where it's going to end. And sometimes that may change a little in the process of writing, but the more I sort of go along, the clearer. I don't tend to sort of do extensive outlining, for example, but I do tend to increasingly have that sense of beginning and end from the start.
Do you edit as you go, or do you just get it all done first and then...
I do a sprint. I just splatter it out on the page, and then I endlessly edit.
And then once that you find that you're content with whatever piece you're working on, what's the next step from there? Where do you go from there? Do you do a stage reading? You get some friends together and it's like, hey, I need to hear this. Can you come over?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the word content probably never really fits anywhere in my playwriting process. So work is never really done as far as I'm concerned, because also it's about the context of the work too, right? So, you know, if I am doing a work that hasn't been done for a while, I have that urge to kind of revise because it's a new context, it's a new world. But yeah, I tend to try to, you know, like have a development workshop. And when I say workshop, that could be literally half a day with actors. I find I always need to hear the work twice. I do like cold reads with actors where they're not super prepared, but I have to hear it twice because I feel like the first time they're kind of just getting their heads around what is this thing, and the first time can be useful, but I find it's typically glacially slow because the actors are like are being so diligent and going, what does this word mean, with every single, and whereas by the second one, it's still fresh enough that actors haven't kind of gotten into sort of a habit or a groove with anything, but they're like, right, I sort of get what this work is now, and the second read is often just the read that I will get the most from. Even if I'm in a longer scenario, read number 3 and 4 and 5, nothing is as gold for me as the second read. So often I will just try to carve out half a day with actors to get those 2 reads in fairly early on. I do want to have a full draft, and I do want to have done a little bit of work on it myself. I definitely want to have had a couple of folks read the work as well, a few folks who I trust, so that I'm just kind of like, getting it to a place that it feels like it can have other voices and other opinions and questions in the room. And and then I will typically, I quite like working on multiple pieces at once. And I'll spend an intensive 3 or 4 weeks on one piece. I put it on a shelf. I turn to the next piece. Then I come back to the first piece for a half-day workshop, and then work on it for the next month, and then bounce backwards and forwards between different works. And and I find then also a more intensive development workshop where we're actually going to play around with staging and potentially partially stage some of the work and read the rest with an audience is super important because, I mean, for me, I have to know how the audience is reacting and responding, and and that's also the joy of previews too. And I got kind of very spoiled with the last production at Stratford. It was the most amount of previews I've ever gotten to have. I think we had maybe 13 previews over a period of a month, because the Stratford Festival has pieces in rep, so the same actors were off kind of doing their other shows, so it meant that I had 13 different audiences to gauge their reactions for and be kind of tweaking the lines and working out, ironing out any sort of kinks in the script. So that was a really fantastic experience.
Nice. Okay, so there's quite a few questions that I have within that whole thing, and hopefully I can remember them all. Are you involved in that when you do your reading? Do you read anything, or do you just sit back and listen? You have somebody read stage directions, you don't involve, you're just there to hear it? Definitely
just sit back and listen. Absolutely. Like, I don't want to have any other responsibilities other than to listen. And I've really trained myself too. The temptation is, it's like, it can be like quite nerve-wracking in some ways to hear these words off the page. I've really trained myself away from the comfort of looking down at the page, and I just close my eyes or look up at the actors, but certainly not at the script, and just listen, because it's just so gold to get to hear the work and hear the actors' interpretations of the work.
You said that you do it twice in one day, so you're the same actors are doing it. You don't bring in a separate. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then the question that I usually ask, and I realize that while listening to you that maybe I'm asking the wrong question, because I always usually ask, when do you know you're done? But I think the question that really is, because you said you're never really done. So I guess the question is, when do you know it's time to stop?
Kind of about half an hour before the curtain opens, really. No, just kidding. Because obviously that's a dance with the director and the actors. Sure. Like, you have to hold the capacity of, okay, how experienced are the actors? How up are they for last minute changes? And that's a real negotiation. But, as long as I'm allowed to make changes respectfully, I will continue to make changes. And I don't know about the context in the US. In Canada, it tends to be more of a theatre culture of single productions. So playwrights love it when you get to have more than one production of the same script, and I wish we did that a lot more in Canada. And for me personally, I've really found that the changes that I make after a first production, I like, for example, Men Express Their Feelings had its second production in first production in Calgary in 2020, just before the lockdown, second production in last year, 2022, in Vancouver. And I rewrote, not entirely rewrote, I refined the script quite significantly between those productions. And I feel like even though I was really happy with the audience response after the first production, I feel like it had just like done that thing that the pot of soup on the stove, when you cook it for a whole day rather than sort of an hour, it just felt like it had really become what it wanted to be.
Where was I going to go with this? I'll get back to that one. I'm going to ask you a different question first of all, because you mentioned previews, but what makes it a preview? I mean, what's different what's the difference between a performance and a preview? I mean, you're still performing the play. It's just not official. I mean, the tickets are not as expensive. I'm curious.
Yeah.
And what's the benefit? What do you get from that?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like when you call something a preview, you're saying to the audience, like, we're really excited for you to be here, and the piece is not quite done yet. And we're going to be, kind of allowing it to just settle in. And I mean, different theatres will have really different relationships to previews. So for example, at Stratford, the preview tickets cost the same amount as the regular tickets. And audiences at Stratford, I feel like, don't always kind of distinguish between previews and after opening night. But it is a really big difference for the team because, I mean, the second, the opening show happens, there's no more script changes. The director is not allowed to give any more notes at all after opening night. So it's sort of, that means that just there's a shift in audience expectations and a shift in sort of what's possible with the show. But that's why I'm saying too that I love the opportunity to have a second production where I can go, you know what? I learned all of this stuff because sometimes I'll learn things from previews that there's not enough time to implement. It would be unfair on the team. It would have design implications. It's too much technically, because that's that real dance, right? Between, I'm one member of the team. I'm the writer, but my work is not important than the technical team's work or the designer's work or the actor's work. So that's that kind of collaboration and negotiation and why, sometimes, the things I learn have to wait for a second production.
So nothing really changes for the audience. They're aware that it's a preview and they just know, okay, I'm going to see this, but if I come back, it might be different. But nothing's being changed during this preview. It's not like you're stopping and,
No. Yeah, so the show is, so yes, there's sometimes the stage, there may be an assistant stage manager on stage or in the front of the audience who's available to prompt actors with lines if needed. But you wouldn't be like, stop the show, let's redo the scene now because I forgot a line. It'd be just the occasional, and this, I don't really remember this happening. But, technically an actor could call line and the stage director could, feed them the line.
Going back to the question that I was going to ask that slipped in my mind. So you said that sometimes that you're changing things. You will change things up to the last minute that you possibly can. Did it ever get to a point where any actors or the directors just frustrated was like, stop. Oh my gosh, again, or it's enough. Have they ever gotten frustrated or have they just lost it because you're continually making changes and they just can't either keep up or...
I mean, if they've lost it, they've been very polite and lost it away from me. But I think, that's where I would never, for example, that's where it's also a real relationship of trust between me and the director. I would never just sit in a rehearsal and go, you know what, everyone, we're just tearing out that page. I would always first consult with the director and go, look, I'd really like to change this and this and this. What do you think? And the director will go, you know what? I hear you that you want to change those things, but my actors are really stressed out right now. We just gave them a full, page of changes yesterday. How important is this to you? Can it wait? Can you let it go? And, and for me, those are always the questions that I'm asking because I also, yes, selfishly, I want the words to be right, but also selfishly, I want the production to be good. And I understand and know that, I can't endlessly ask, the actors are working really hard, so are the tech team, so is everyone's working really hard. So that's just that kind of, dance between, what could we do in an ideal world versus, what do we got? What's the time? What are the resources?
Are you at every single rehearsal?
No, I'm definitely, in a first production, I like to be at a lot of the rehearsal process. They're unavailable to learn and make discoveries and do small rewrites on the fly or accept offers from actors. But there's also, I think, a real benefit even in a first production in me stepping outside of the room because otherwise it can also be tempting for everything to be a writing fix. And, rather than sort of, the team kind of chewing on and going, now wait a minute, why was this written like this? What what could be what's maybe a kind of an acting or a direction fix. And I've learnt that that's been some discipline for myself too, because I'm very quick to go to a writing fix rather than I've had to kind of learn to trust processes to sort of unfold. That I feel like in the past sometimes I've prematurely done a writing fix when I perhaps could have just left them be for a little longer and let them find their way to, a different solution.
Is that coming from wanting to do a writing fix? Is that coming from a place of insecurity that you did something wrong, or is it just that it just feels like it's your responsibility to fix that rather than?
Honestly, I think it's often coming from a place of impatience and of that kind of stress container. Like it's like, being in these intensive rehearsals, and that's actually what I loved about the Stratford process, was because we were rehearsing in rep. So we were rehearsing kind of maybe 3 days a week, and then the same actors, they were doing the Olympics. They were rehearsing 6 days a week, 3 days on my show, 3 days on another show. But me, I was getting that kind of more space in between, so it was not such a pressure cooker for me. But when I'm in a full-time rehearsal process, it's like, oh, we got to solve this now. We got to solve this now. And so sometimes it can kind of, particularly with a new piece, it can be easy to second guess myself. And I think it's less from insecurity and more from, could there be a different solution here? Could there be a different something? And, but I feel like, I'm getting better at kind of discerning between, right, this is a text fix versus this is I'm not sure yet. Wait and see. Let the process play out a little longer. And sometimes I might even have a text fix that I go home and work on, but don't quite give yet.
You mentioned that and I lost it again. Let me go on to something else then in that regard. Oh, that's what it is. I'm sorry. You said rehearsal. You rehearse and rep, and that's the first time that I've heard that phrase. What is that?
Yeah, so that's like where the same creative team is rehearsing more than one thing at once. So as part of, for example, when my other shows have gone up in theatre seasons, it's like, mine is the only show in that particular theatre for that, kind of month or however long it's running. Whereas at Stratford, they have, they slowly kind of fold in new shows into the season until at the peak, there's 13 shows running at once. So you could then, because the Stratford Festival, it's Canada's largest theatre festival, and it's a very big international audience. So you can come into town for a weekend and you could catch 5 shows if you wanted to. And so so it really is the Olympics of acting, because actors are in 2 or 3 shows at the same time. So Saturday matinee, they'll do one show. Sunday matinee, they'll do another show. Tuesday, they'll be back to the first show. Wednesday night, they'll be back to, the second show, backwards and forwards. So, and similarly, the rehearsal process, even though there are early starters and late starters, as in, some rehearsals for some shows start first, and then when it's a little further along, the rehearsals for the second show start, but you're still rehearsing the first one. So that, certainly was a lot of pressure on the actors. But for me as the playwright, where I was only, the writer for one play, it was an absolute dream.
What's the process for that? I mean, is the piece already written and then you submit it, or do they say, hey, we like your work, we want to bring you on to commission something, and it's being written as you go? How does this work as far as Stratford goes?
Well, for Stratford, like with most festivals, there's sort of a relationship building period over, often quite a lengthy period of time. So, for example, with Stratford, I first was brought in as a consultant on a work in, I think it was 2017 that they thought I would, could have some input into. So I came on as a consultant. Then the following year, I was invited onto their playwriting retreat, which is an invite-only sort of 10 playwrights getting to spend 3 weeks up, with the company and, getting to work on our work. And then from there, the director of new play development read a particular script of mine, Every Little Nookie, and we both agreed that it would be it was quite a wild piece for the festival. And I was really thrilled that the festival got the vision of this piece and saw it as something that would be for their audiences, even though it was very, very different than their usual pieces. And so it went into, kind of stage of development at Stratford, and they're developing many new plays at once. They're involved in supporting, not all of which go to production, and then it got shortlisted for production and then selected from there. But that was, so it was 2022 when it premiered. So that's a 5-year kind of slow relationship of getting to know the company and them getting to know me and my work. And I really find that with, I take a sort of a long and slow approach to all of my relationship building with theatres, because, I want to make sure that I'm working with theatres and creatives who I gel with, and I also understand and appreciate that they need to get to know me as well and understand, it's a big commitment to work on a piece together. These, like I was saying before, these real pressure cooker situations, and, you want to know that you're working with solid folks. So, that takes time to build that trust.
Not that this is the important aspect. I'm just curious. Is this a paid process, or are you getting paid once the tickets sell and then you're making money on the back end?
Yeah. So Stratford will often do, when they're pretty sure that they want to program something, they'll do commissions, which will be a kind of set fee, for the kind of writing process. But then most of the money comes from royalties from the show. But I also, applied for my own funding, which is pretty different, the context in Canada. I applied for, there is more government funding. There's less funding from foundations and less of a commercial theatre scene, but there's more government funding.
You mentioned the writers' retreat. So what's that like? What's the whole gambit there? So that's your second year you were commissioned, and then you got invited in this. And so what's the process? How's it start? And then what's a day by day look like? And then how does it end? What do you leave with once you start?
Yeah. Well, that one was fairly open in terms of, it was 3 weeks where we got, kind of accommodation and a certain amount of, meals as well, and a per diem to buy meals. And it was really time and space away from our usual environments to get to write. And we had the opportunity to kind of have dramaturgical feedback throughout that period and dinners with the other artists. So I met, a bunch of Canada's most interesting and intriguing artists at that residency. So really kind of a period to develop a relationship with the company, but also with other artists. And one of the artists I met there, Carmen Aguirre, I've ended up collaborating with. So another project that's actually coming up shortly for premiere is called Climate Change and Other Small Talk. And, actually that's a good example of, like, when you asked earlier, so often for pieces I have the title, the first scene, the last scene, and then I've got to fill in the middle. Climate Change and Other Small Talk was a good example of a piece that actually got significantly overhauled in both form and content from when I first started it. So I first kind of I've been getting increasingly worried about climate stuff, as most of us have been for a lot of years. And I went, right, that's it. I've got to start making bodies of work about climate change. So I applied and got accepted into this incredible and very unusual artist residency called the Arctic Circle. And it's an American not-for-profit company, and the residency itself is on a tall ship in the high Arctic, so way north of Scandinavia. 30 artists and scientists go on a boat together for 3 weeks. And I, was on the boat thinking, right, okay, I'm going to write. I was chewing on all these sort of questions about climate change, and I went, okay, I'm going to write this full-length play. And my idea changed entirely when we arrived at New Alesund, which is the world's northernmost climate research station. And scientists up there, do all of their science research with their fancy instruments and things, and we watch them release their daily weather balloon, and that all that data that they gather and that info they gather is really, really important to understand their local context in terms of how is the climate changing there, what are the impacts on land, on people, etc. But it's not until and so that's the local is very important, but also we can't fully understand climate change until they combine that data together with hundreds of other weather stations around the world who all collect their own microdata as well. So it's this real sort of interplay between the local and the global. And I started kind of thinking about, a lot of the climate solutions, they're not one size fits all. We have to have this kind of global cooperation and global agreement on things, but also the solutions need to be very micro tailored to local environments. And so I thought, okay, well, why not do the same thing with artists? And so instead of kind of me, this single playwright writing this full-length work, I decided, okay, I'm going to invite a number of teams around the world to each create their own locally relevant and locally specific work. And then we'll combine them together into this global podcast. And so the format is their radio dramas, their audio dramas. And so these 9 creative teams from around the world are creating these works, and and it's sort of really inspired by sort of science, which is obviously extremely important. We need the facts, otherwise we might just kind of be perplexed at why it's hot and stormy and rainy. We need the facts, but science doesn't change culture. Facts don't change culture, stories change culture. So okay, how can artists be part of throwing down in the same way that scientists are to change our cultures or our ways of seeing the world? So that's then, kind of an example again of kind of my obsession with the form and the style reflecting the content. And kind of when I dug into climate change themes, I kind of went, actually, the whole form of this wanted to change.
Okay, so I do want to unpack a lot of that with climate change and other small talk in that process as well. But if you're either you're on the boat, or you're doing the Stratford process, or the writer's retreat in that regard. So how much time is dedicated to writing? How much time is dedicated to networking and spending time? And then how do you keep yourself from getting distracted in this environment?
Yeah, well, I feel like the residencies that I've done are such an incredible gift, because it's miraculous how much you can get done when you're not having to, vacuum and cook and, kind of take care of all of those, daily things that we have to do in our regular lives. So I feel like on these residencies, I get full days of writing and creative work done, and then I get the most leisurely, incredible 3-hour-long dinners with artists and hangouts and social time, and somehow time just kind of feels stretched and in the most amazing ways. And there's a bunch of residencies around the US as well, a number of which I've done, which actually it's competitive to apply to, so you have to kind of submit your application and be accepted. Once you're accepted, you need to pay to get yourself there. Once you're there, you get a studio to write in. You get your accommodation. You get all your meals covered and all your meals cooked for and delivered to you. And it's the most decadent and incredible way to create. And just with that nourishment of both the food, but also the creative conversations. And everyone there are, professional full-time, not necessarily full-time working artists, but professional artists. So there's a real kind of culture of hanging out and socializing, but I found it very easy to focus and not get distracted because there's plenty of that hangout time, but there's also just all day long that I can write undistracted.
So because it's funny because this is kind of an ongoing thing that's come up in a number of episodes, and because you brought up, you don't have to vacuum, you don't have to sweep, you don't have to do. But the truth of the matter is we don't have to either. We'll just choose to do it instead of write. So how do you not fill that time up with distractions when you're at this retreat?
Yeah.
I find that as writers, that's what we do. We'll find something else to do rather than write.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's the same thing at retreats versus in my regular life. I mean, something that does really motivate me is deadlines and accountability to other people. So, when I've got a dramaturge or literary manager or somebody waiting for my script, I'm much less likely to kind of let myself be distracted than if I'm just endlessly, I have months and no accountability. And I feel like that's also, as I've matured as a writer and an artist too, I've gotten much better at writing under all circumstances. So I used to kind of need to have a lot of space and wait for wait for the kind of creative inspiration to sort of waft down from the heavens and grace me, before I'd start writing. And now I'm much better at just plonking myself in front of the computer and just literally getting my fingers and tapping the keys, and writing absolute drivel until, a page later something interesting is coming out. And I've just gotten better at kind of even if I'm grumpy, if I'm tired, if I'm whatever's going on, at being able to write. And that is a muscle that you can develop. Some people are just, kind of gifted from the start with being able to write under all circumstances, and other folks, it is definitely a skill that you can learn.
Well, I find that, it's just starting. It's just sitting down, because I think that once you sit down for that first time and that flow happens, now you're motivated, now you're excited and you can't wait. And then all of a sudden, you're force yourself to stop, you go to bed, and then all of a sudden the wheels are still turning and you can't stop thinking about it. And, all that, so it's a fascinating aspect in that regard. Once you start, you mentioned that that these retreats are very competitive. What's the process for these retreats? And then what's the trick that you learned that has gotten you to be so successful? Is it your success that's gotten you into them at this point, or did you learn something that you started to apply that's gotten you into these retreats? What are the tips that you can give to listeners? Because we haven't really, this is an aspect that we haven't covered in any episodes as far as writing retreats go, and how to get in them, the process of it, and what is the secret, if there is one, to getting in?
I mean, for starters, I feel like one of my own personal secrets of how I've gotten to where I've gotten is learning how to deal with rejection. Sometimes I kind of joke, whoever can deal the best with the continual barrages of no, will eventually become, the most senior theater people. And, I meet playwrights or writers or creatives who are incredible creators or really interesting creators. And often they'll sort of go, oh yeah, no, I applied for that once and didn't get in. I'm like, you applied for that once? I just doggedly keep on applying for things. And I've also really just developed a practice of saying thank you when there's a no, because somebody has taken, or not just somebody, a number of people have taken a lot of time to sit there and consider who are they going to program for this thing. And it's not easy to like reject other people and say no to other people. Artistic directors are notorious for saying a maybe rather than a yes or a no. I think a lot of people don't like to let other people down. And so, being appreciative of people's time, and also just learning to really not take it personally. I've sat on a lot of juries now too, and it is mind-boggling. I sat on like the Dora jury, which is kind of like the Canadian Tonys, and so I went and saw probably 70 shows that year, and had to kind of assess between them. There was 10 of us on the jury, and it was unbelievable. So we're 10 theatre professionals. And there would be the same show. 3 people are like, oh, that was just brilliant. It was sublime. It was incredible. I was sobbing by the end, and then I was laughing. And then 2 people are like, I will never get that 2 hours back of my life. It's just like, it's so subjective. Sure. And it's so, time and context and audience dependent. Who does it resonate with and who doesn't it? And so for me, then just really remembering that just because somebody says no or doesn't like my work, or gives it a bad review, or to just kind of like take that in my stride and not take that personally, and and learn from that as well. Like sometimes if I'm getting continual no's for the same thing, or very consistent feedback, I've got to listen to that, because I'm not the sort of artist that is like, let me have my artistic autonomy, I just want to create what I want to create. I create to be in conversation with audiences, in conversation with people. So if there's some way that conversation is not landing properly, I need to know that, and so the no's can be interesting to take into account, but also the gatekeepers are not the arbiters ultimately of good and bad art. And so really just kind of learning to persist and to keep going, and keeping on applying and applying and applying for the residencies, and once you get the first one. Also, at my very first residency, which was the Blue Mountain Center, I then at the residency, I was having the best time and eating the amazing food, and and I started asking all the other artists. I was basically like, I just want to permanently move to residencies. I never want to have to like make a meal again. So I asked all the other artists. I was like, okay, what are the other residencies you know of? What are, because there are databases, but they're quite overwhelming, because there's literally hundreds of residencies, and it's quite difficult to know which are the kind of more legit ones, which ones might be more suitable for my work, because yes, there's the published description and criteria, but sometimes sort of you can't always really decipher, would my work be a great match for this residency or not. I mean, it's also, would my work be a good match for this residency on this particular jury on this year? Because the juries change too, and sometimes if the quality of snacks in the room was not good, then they're going to make a totally different decision than if they had a good coffee and then were So but at that first residency, I came away with a long list of sort of all the different residencies, the pros and cons, and from having had all these deep conversations with other artists throughout my month there, they were all like, oh, now we know a bit about your work, you should definitely apply to Yaddo, or whichever these other ones. So that kind of gave me a short list of ones to apply for, rather than the overwhelming database of like, which ones should I put in for.
Expand on that. So now that we know your work, you should apply to this. How, what's the match? Does that make sense? What is it about the work and the residency that goes hand in hand? Yeah.
Well, I mean, so for example, each of the residencies have different focuses. So the Blue Mountain Center is specifically focused on work with social justice themes. And I mean, it's interesting. Now that you kind of asked that question, I also want to say that I've built an entire career off, sort of defying other people's expectations of where my work would and wouldn't be received. And I don't mean defying in a kind of like, brattish way. Like I'm not really out to kind of prove people wrong. I mean more like being critical of. So, nobody would have seen a socialist sex romp at the Stratford Festival. And people were quite sort of intrigued when this work got announced. I mean, there is one other example of a sort of a piece that was kind of centered around a bunch of sex at the festival that had done very well. But just even that combination of kind of exploring alternative economic models and, a kind of high energy sex romp just didn't quite, it was not the usual Stratford work. And all of my peers were like, wow, I'm really surprised. I'm surprised, that this work is being programmed there. But then when you sort of look a little bit deeper, like actually there are a lot of perfect matches of that piece with Stratford, but I had to be the one to make those connections. And in fact, the person there who, the director of new play development, Bob White, was such an incredible champion for the work. I still had to, make some of the connections because, I mean, he's reading hundreds of plays. He's there, supporting all of these different playwrights, out and doing his thing. He's really busy. I don't know how he fit it all in, to be honest. And so, when I, at the Playwrights retreat, gave him Every Little Nookie and he read it and he said, this was a fantastic read. We discussed the characters and he, pushed the script back across to me because, he's probably really tired and overworked. And it took me going, could you see this as a match for Stratford? And then he went, well, I hadn't really thought of that, but you know what? Now that I think about it, okay, this is a comedy of manners. Yes, we have done comedy of manners before. Okay, there was, and I had referenced, and you have done, you did Hannah Moskovich's Bunny. So audiences are clearly not afraid of quite explicit content. And I sort of mapped out and kind of matched, went, well, here's what audiences have responded to. Here's how I'm seeing this. And he went, you know what? I think this is a really interesting idea. And, but it took me sort of going, I'm going to have a vision here and carefully follow and see what our audience is responding to, what work is being programmed, what do I want to make, and could I see a way and a universe in which my work could be a match here? Because I do often think that programmers are a lot more conservative than audiences. And but programmers often want to take want like interesting and vibrant work. They're just so overworked and also, trying to keep the theaters afloat that they need help sometimes in going, here is how my work can sit within your season, your festival, be relevant to your audiences, shake things up. I know you want a younger audience. Well, here is, but you also have to be, look after your more senior audiences as well. Well, here's Every Little Nookie. It's an intergenerational piece. There are 3 boomer characters who are, 2 of them are your mainstay Stratford audience. They're going to see themselves on stage. And those 3 boomer characters are interacting in this world of 5 millennial characters too. That's going to bring in your millennial audiences. So just kind of really being smart, like letting the kind of the artist have a partnership with the producer in your brain and looking at kind of where do you want this work? Where do you believe it should be? And, crafting, if you were the artistic director, how would you write the program note of how this work fits within this season? So just kind of really carving out your own vision for where you believe your work should be, and then crafting, using all of your creative skills and your writing skills and your storytelling skills to craft the story for somebody of why your work belongs there. And the same thing goes exactly for residency applications. If you want to go to Yaddo because, the food is really good and it's prestigious and, blah, like look up who's been there, look up everything you can about it, and how can you tell the story of why you belong in that space.
So it's pretty much you got to familiarize yourself with either the platform or the retreat, and then make a case for why your work fits there. Which is that's fascinating. It's a great tip. So on that note, then, what makes a good retreat and what makes a bad retreat?
The good question. I mean, I think a huge amount of it is the other people who are there. So some of that sort of luck of the draw, and others of it is, what type of retreat is it? So I can be because a lot of my work does deal with social justice themes or themes of justice, I can be pretty sure that I'm going to like, a bunch of the people at the Blue Mountain Center, for example. Also, I personally like the open space to just create whatever I want. I prefer to not have some residencies sort of ask you to have to run workshops or, kind of be, have outcomes for the local community. And there's I think that can be really fascinating. For me, I love just kind of open space where I get to just go down total writing rabbit holes and, really just focus on my work. So I sort of tend to prefer the ones that don't have that type of outcome. And I also think ones like a lot of the ones in the US, I've also done a bunch of kind of been in residence with theatre companies, and rather than physical residence, it's then sort of as the resident playwright of a theatre company, I'm developing a work with their support, with their dramaturgical support, etc. And that tends to be, it's not a physical residency, but it tends to be over a longer period of time. I'm the playwright in residence for a year, and that's different. In that circumstance, I'm sort of happier to run workshops or do other things, and enjoy the support of the company for that longer period of time. But I really love the kind of shorter, month-long physical residencies where I get to just create.
Has there ever been a residency where you're just like, oh my, what am I doing here? Why did I just can't wait for this to be over and I'll never go back? Never
would I ever be like, I just can't wait to cook my own meals again and have to vacuum. No, I really love. I mean, often by the end of the month, I am ready to go.
Sure,
but the month has been incredible.
So let's jump over to climate change and other small talk. So this is a selection of pieces from a bunch of different playwrights.
Yeah,
and they're recorded as a radio play that you said. So how much is one of those pieces? One of those pieces is yours.
One
yes?
of those episodes is mine. Yeah.
And then, how much say did you have in any of the other pieces? Did they bring to the table and you said, this is okay, but can you tweak this? I know this is more from a production aspect, but from a writer standpoint that's also producing, how much pull or say did you have in some of these pieces to make it fit what you're looking for?
Yeah. So I set the initial parameters, and the parameters were, okay, it has to fit with the tongue-in-cheek title, Climate Change and Other Small Talk. So and I kind of gave, I guess, 3 kind of loose categories: satire, absurdity, or some form of humor. Because I went, okay, so many people know and care about what's happening with the planet, and so many people are so anxious and overwhelmed, and it's really tempting to just sort of, flick past the page in the newspaper or kind of watch a cat video instead of reading, the latest report or something or other. So these have to be entertaining and not necessarily all laugh out loud funny, but they have to kind of somehow get in sideways, genre-wise, take a slightly different approach to what is otherwise a very serious topic. So that was kind of a very key parameter. They had to be audio drama because I wanted to share this as a podcast and have a kind of way that, we could have a worldwide audience. Even though there's actually a live and in-person component to this too. So in addition to the 9-episode podcast, then these 9 theatre companies around the world are all programming their own in-person events, so listening parties or installations or other ways to gather people to listen to one or more episodes. So yeah, the style parameter, the audio drama, and a length anywhere from 8 to 20 minutes. And then myself and I've been working on this with an impact producer, came up with a series of kind of prompts that were sort of also very based around principles of climate justice and really on looking at the sort of systemic. So what I was interested with in this series was less of kind of trying to challenge individuals to like sort of be better in their own, recycling practices or whatever, and more looking at these larger systemic things. So these larger systems of how we organize our economy, ways that kind of corporations are tending to have a really outsized influence on politics, like these larger systemic things, what has gotten us into this mess and what could get us out. So those were kind of like the parameters was, yes, tell stories, make it personal. We need really engaging characters, but also that kind of explore this larger systemic layer. So I gave these parameters and then, gave the 9 creative teams a fair bit of autonomy. In reality, then the writing process looked quite different with different companies and different playwrights. Some I was a lot more involved with. I mean, one play I had sort of, maybe 6 or 7 or 8 dramaturgical meetings with over different drafts. Other plays I just kind of read, once or twice and gave some kind of minor, thoughts and feedbacks and, but largely sort of left them to their own devices. And for me, it was kind of about going, how have you met sort of what I laid out as the parameters? And some works, needed a style adjustment or, so it just depended on, whether the playwrights had sort of, like my job was still to kind of keep the overall vision of this project alive. And then I was, just made myself available that some playwrights wanted more of a process with me too.
What's the difference in writing a traditional piece opposed to a radio play? What changes when you're writing a radio play?
I got really into radio plays during the pandemic. I mean, it was obviously, suddenly overnight we couldn't do what we do. And I made a decision early on in the pandemic that, I fully supported my peers in doing Zoom plays and Zoom readings. We do what we got to do. I'd made a decision for myself that if I was going to do digital work, I wanted to do true digital adaptations. So adaptations or creations from scratch that actually suited that medium. So I made, Childish, a piece where I had conversations with over 40 children, and then I have adult actors speaking their exact words, word for word. That I adapted into a web series and shot in playgrounds. And then so that was kind of an adaptation into a visual format. And then with, and I got really into this world of radio dramas, and it is incredible. For folks who haven't listened to audio dramas before, I highly encourage you to try. It's just amazing to me what you can evoke with, I heard someone describe radio plays as like movies for your ears, and what you can evoke with just sound. And it was actually fascinating process that, in even in live theatre, we have a contract or an agreement with the audience that we are going to suspend, our disbelief and use our imaginations. In audio drama, you take that even further, like the audience has to be next level active because they have one sense that you are giving them all of this information for, and you can evoke things that they then use their imagination to fill in, to the next degree. So I also had to learn, things like intimacy and violence are really different as an audio drama, because often our imaginations will go way further if you remove one sense, which is, the visual. So, just then, a process of kind of going, okay, what are the sounds that would bring me into this world? And it's this very aligned, still kind of dialogue based, etc. But you can also you can have an unlimited set and costume budget in an audio drama. So, it's much easier to set something on the moon or in a high-speed, car chase, or the genre possibilities are closer to a really high-budget movie than they are to a live theatre piece. And in that way also, depending on your choices with the sound design, there's more sort of possibilities to tip the audience towards realism, if you want, or with kind of working smartly with sound designers to sort of tip the listening into a completely fantastical, absurd world. So, just a really cool new medium for me to work in that many people have been working in for many years.
What radio plays inspired you to take this leap, this next step? What were you listening to that I like CBC's Play Me. CBC is the Canadian Broadcasting Commission. Mm-hmm. There's an audio drama series called Play Me, which is sort of turns Canadian plays into radio dramas. And it's quite fascinating, even though it turns plays that were meant for the live stage into radio dramas. It's quite amazing to see how they translate into audio drama. I still ultimately, for me, I adapted Men Express Their Feelings into a radio drama, but for Climate Change and Other Small Talk, I decided to actually create from scratch as a radio drama. But I also really like there's podcasts like The Truth, which I don't even know, would you technically, I would count that as audio drama, that, just brings us into these sonic worlds that are very cool. So you're not going back to The Shadow or the Philip Marlowe detective.
No.
So you're not going back to the 30s and 40s. You're just kind of, you were inspired by more modern pieces then.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what does that look like on the page then? Because obviously you're not doing stage directions.
Yeah.
And my guess that you're writing sound directions, and then how is that on the page?
And that's and that's really important, to be very explicit with the whole sonic world, with all the sounds, because the difference that you have to do when writing a radio play is, as somebody more used to writing for, the stage, it's you have to really go through every single scene and go, can you understand what is going on from just the dialogue and the sounds? So really kind of specifically writing in, sound, footsteps approaching, and a door slams, writing in sort of, and then ominous music, or, so it doesn't necessarily, it can still sort of leave a lot of space for the sound designer, but writing in those kind of, I write in things that I would never write into a stage play script, because it would feel like directing on the page. It's a little bit different because the sound things like the footsteps approaching and the door slamming are part of the storytelling. Sure. In a way that on a live stage they might not be quite as important.
What are the examples that you would never put on a stage play that would be directing on a page? Can you think of any offhand? This is, as I always say in some of these episodes, there's always that one question that when you're not writing, you're not in that moment of writing, that there's a question that puts you on the spot where you really may not know the answer. So if you can't think of an example, it's okay.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't think of an example right now. But it is in, you know, when you look at my kind of script for these radio dramas, it's a lot more granular what the sounds are.
How do you record these pieces once you've had them written? Do you just set up some microphones and record it all together, or is everybody doing their own individual part and then you splice together?
Yeah.
Or do you go to that old school approach where you got the music stands, you got the microphones in front of 2 or 3 actors, and they're reading their lines, or is it everything memorized?
Yeah, I mean, I've done now a couple of different ways. During the pandemic, because I adapted Men Express Their Feelings into an audio drama, so it's kind of in a sense had 3 productions really, if you count the audio drama as well. But because we were in a pandemic and we couldn't have the actors in the same space together, we recorded all of the actors actually ended up recording in their homes and kind of built blanket forts and, you know, kind of built sort of dead spaces sound-wise in their own homes. And then they were all connected together. The company sent microphones out to everybody. And but everybody was, you know, on, I think it was River FM or one of the platforms that's not Zoom, together, doing it live together. So it wasn't kind of, you know, so everyone could still be responsive off each other and, you know, really feeding off each other. But yeah, nobody had to memorize scripts, which also was quite delightful for rewrites because, you know, I could literally rewrite in the recording session in some moments. And then also I recorded the pilot of Climate Change and Other Small Talk with actors physically in a space together, and really learnt the lesson though of they were all in the same space, and it gave us a lot less flexibility in the edit because we couldn't like just kind of pull apart and add an extra couple of beats in post-production between these 2 lines if there was bleed from one microphone to the other. So then my preference then became to record the actors in different spaces, but definitely always at the same time, as in so they could be responsive off each other. I also, though, I think there's something to be said for a real richness of sound to record. So, for example, on the Truth podcast that I'd mentioned, there's this episode, you know, sort of set in a classroom. I can't remember what it's called, but it's one of the kind of more famous episodes from this particular podcast. And it's about a teacher who goes kind of completely, you know, off the deep end. And I know that was recorded in an actual classroom, and they had, you know, several mics around the space. And that meant that also there was a real depth and dimensionality, however you say that word, to the sound, because you really felt like, oh yeah, that character is at the back of the classroom, and now this character is, you know, and you can create a certain amount of that. And that's sort of where directing for audio drama is quite different because, you know, for example, okay, if I talk over here like this, then you're going to be picking me up more and then I'm walking towards the microphone, walking towards the character, and then I, you know, step back off the microphone, and it sounds quite different. So, you know, there's still a blocking that's required in directing for radio drama, but it's quite different than blocking on a stage. So you can achieve that when you have, you know, actors each on their own microphones, but there's also, you know, depending on the vision of the piece, there's a real time and place for actually putting actors in a physical space doing kind of physical blocking in a more sort of naturalistic way, you know, to record it in that way.
You talked about there were certain requirements that you had when you sent out the guidelines for this.
For the 9 playwrights.
And you said satire, but then you said absurd.
Yep.
So how does that process work? What's writing an absurd piece entail?
I mean, I'm not necessarily meaning absurdity in sort of like the, you know, maybe textbook theatrical
that traditional
definition.
Old school theater of the absurd back from the
Yeah, no, I more sort of mean absurdity sort of in more like a pop culture way, like well, not necessarily pop culture, but in a kind of a cultural context of, for example, in my episode, Amazon takes over emergency services. And then there's a couple in their home, and at first, you can hear the flood sounds. Their home is being flooded. You know that sort of water is filling up the flood, and they're frantically like kind of drafting a message. And at first, obviously you think, you don't know at this point that Amazon has taken over emergency service. You think, right, they're calling for help or something, and then they start reading out the message that they've drafted, and it's it's all about Amazon. You sent us a full-size sofa bed, and it should be illegal to call this salmon-colored. It is closer to Tuscan red, and it's held together by a staple and a prayer. So they spend then their time leaving horrible reviews for Amazon and being in this sort of like antagonistic relationship with Amazon, and every time they sort of look like they're going to take action, Amazon sort of manipulates them into not taking action. So it's clearly, this is not a piece of realism. It's a satire in many ways, but it's just also an absurd premise, and it's clearly you would not be doing that in an emergency. And there's, I'd say, kind of maybe half of the pieces sort of fit somewhere into either the satire or absurdity realm, and the other half sort of fit into, kind of some like humorous banter, but more into a kind of realism realm.
How did you adjust your work when you first started out? I mean, obviously, there had to be a growing process. So, how did you teach yourself to get beyond that beginning aspect and fix whatever habits that you had or mistakes that you were making? And how did you learn that, and how did you tweak it?
Yeah.
What were they?
Do you mean from like the earlier days of my career?
Yeah.
I mean, for starters, to say that my audiences have been very important in that respect. I was in very close relationship with my audiences because I used to put stuff on in basements, living rooms, open mics, like kind of, etc. And so I was getting continual and very regular feedback on my work. What was working? What was resonating? What wasn't? I'd be in conversation with the works. But interestingly, I also feel like there was a period where I needed more rigorous creative feedback, because I feel like in my earlier days I got away with some sloppiness in my work because my work was so different and so needed. And when I say different, it was content that I was not seeing anywhere else. It was stylistically very different, and my audiences were extremely hungry for that content and that type of work. And so I feel like, I would have these, I would have audience members come up and pour their whole hearts and souls out to me, and, because they were resonating with the content. But I feel like, I needed to put myself in kind of context where people would go, well, that's really interesting, and I love that you're doing that in a completely different way than what other people are. Keep that part, but also, like, what's going on with this scene? Like, why have you got this scene in here? It's just floating there, and that's been a tricky process, because also I feel like there was a growing period where I went from kind of like, just chucking stuff together and, responding to my audiences, to then kind of when I had this body of work that theatres and professional spaces were starting to take notice and go, oh, that's a really interesting artist, let's have him in here. All right, here's space, you'll be in the season, like blah. In that kind of, that sort of transition period there, I also was getting access for the first time to professional dramaturgy, to, increasingly high-profile directors and other creatives, and they were giving me this really interesting, sharp, insightful feedback. And also, there were times when I feel like I made decisions that a more mature me would go, you know what? that's interesting feedback, thank you, but that's not actually my aesthetic. That's not my, yes to the first 7 things you said, and suggestion number or question number 8, 9, and 10, no. And I went through, I think, a phase where I was a little more uncertain of those 10 possibilities or questions or suggestions, which ones fit my work, because I was really kind of learning how to kind of fuse this very DIY background I had with this kind of new professional world that I had.
But what degree of humility is involved in that, those beginning steps where you kind of put the ego to the side and were willing to listen, opposed to somebody else was like, you don't understand me, so thank you, but no thanks. You just, like when you said, what is that scene about? At what point did you really think, okay, I need to listen to this, opposed to just blowing it off and saying, I know better than you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult kind of skill to learn. For me, I have a sort of philosophy and approach to always listen to every single micro note. Sometimes I just immediately, and I think I don't know, maybe it's almost a different feeling in my body when I'm kind of know that I'm getting a reaction where I'm feeling a little stubborn, maybe a little embarrassed, a little something or other. That's usually a sign that it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to take the feedback. It's a sign that I need to step back and just, have a moment, like whether that's, and usually my practice, even if I think something is a completely brilliant idea or if I think it's a terrible idea, I say, thank you, I'm going to think about that. And because then people know that I also am, my collaborators tell me that I am a very open playwright. I'm not a kind of a stubborn playwright, but because I'm then sort of often receiving, thank you, I'm going to think about that. And then I come back the next day and they see, oh, he's taken like these 4 suggestions and not those 2. Then it sort of creates a kind of a culture of I'm not going to immediately, have a knee-jerk reaction. And knee-jerk reaction in either a direction of, oh my God, yes, you're so right, I have to do that. Or a knee-jerk reaction of, no, that's a terrible idea. And it just gives me that little bit of space to go away and kind of unpack through, okay, is that because I'm a bit embarrassed that I'm like, yeah, that was a ridiculous scene. How could I have how could I have written that? I'm a little humiliated that I wrote that, versus, what's a reaction of, I see how your suggestion would work in another play. That's not my vision. And when I come back to a collaborator too, when I'm sort of ignoring or choosing to not, take some of their feedback. Like, I mean, I have had an example in a piece where with a dramaturge who I absolutely respect, like she's a fantastic dramaturge. We had a great relationship. She was a huge contribution to this piece. And there was, and she was also very opinionated. And there's one thing she said, look, this is just not going to work. This is not going to work. And I, and there are other things that I'm like, ultimately, yes, you're right. I'm, and I'm going to change that. This particular thing, I was like, no, I'm not, that's my vision for the work is different. And so it was my job then to enroll her and say, look, I want to do this. You may be right. You may absolutely be right in your opinion around this. I'm really committed to giving this a really good go, and I really want your help to help me make this work. And then she shifted to go, right, it's her job to help me make something work rather than her job to kind of show me that it doesn't work. And, and that's, I don't know, I don't always know. And if I had the magical, machine or something that would help me discern when is that moment versus when is a moment, to go, you're right, I'm gonna do it your way, then, I would love that. But that's I feel like that is a thing that a muscle that I'm kind of developing more and more as I go along.
What's your style? You mentioned your style. What is your style?
I mean, most of my work has some form of kind of like in the TV world, you might say dramedy. Most of my work has some form of kind of comedy that has substance. So that, you know, really looks at kind of serious things or difficult to talk about things, but gets in kind of sideways through humor and comedy. And stylistically too, as I was mentioning before, really kind of making the style of the piece. So within that kind of general world of, okay, comedies with substance, still making formal and stylistic decisions based on the content. So I told you about, for example, Men Express Their Feelings and Climate Change and Other Small Talk. Every Little Nookie at the Stratford Festival. Okay, so it's about, you know, kind of open relationships, polyamory, monogamy, really interrogating the nuclear family unit and sort of looking at if we could kind of tip our relationship to intimacy and sex, what would that open out in terms of our economic systems, our housing crises, our, you know, all manner of other things. And so as the piece kind of goes on, I have increasingly meshed scenes. So as these kind of webs of relationships become more tangled, so too does the actual structure of the scenes. So, and at its peak, you know, just before we kind of hit the crisis, there's 5 different scenes being played out at once. So there's like, you know, one character will be in 2 scenes at once, and another character's in 2 scenes at once. And so I've kind of crafted these scenes to sort of, you know, mesh together in the same ways that these sort of relationships are meshing together. So I would say that is my style as well, is to make, to, you know, interrogate the form and style of the work as much as the content.
How much has a publicist helped your career? At what point do you think that a playwright should take that step?
Interesting question. I mean, I feel like I don't have a personal publicist, for example. I have only had project-specific publicists. And I mean, you know, they have been definitely essential, though, on projects because, you know, they've helped make the production successful by getting in audiences and media, and, you know, and sometimes the reviews, that snippet from the review is really, really important. So, you know, yeah, but for me, they've all been project specific rather than I don't have, you know, a one publicist who I work with on everything across my work.
Are they more accessible than people realize, or is it still a good chunk of change that you just kind of have to swallow and hope that you make up for it on the back end?
Yeah. I mean, all different, like there are all different publicists. It's one of those kind of fields that's how long is a piece of string. There are publicists who will, you know, kind of do work on a shoestring budget. And then there are those that charge an enormous amount just as a kind of monthly retainer to be available in case you need them. So yeah, really different ranges, and honestly not easy to find the right publicist and the right match for a project. So it definitely sort of takes a lot of asking around and, you know, kind of word of mouth referral.
What makes a good match?
I think, you know, definitely them understanding the vision of your work, but also equally understanding who you want to communicate with, and having the skills to push you around your communications with those audiences or that media. So, for example, the process with Climate Change and Other Small Talk, you know, I have the kind of artistic end and I'm holding the artistic end. And then there's also the end of like, okay, how, you know, it's that interface, it's that sort of the Venn diagram overlap between the creative, communicating the creative ideas, but also in a way that audiences and media will understand. And in a way that, and for Climate Change and Other Small Talk, I'm aiming to reach quite a broad audience. So also, trusting my publicist, who has, a huge amount of experience, trusting that she sort of understands how to position the work in a way that will draw media outlets in rather than sort of, put them off.
What are you working on now?
Well, I mean, I'm Climate Change and Other Small Talk launches on April 22nd on Earth Day. So I'm in the last kind of stages of frantically, pulling all the pieces together for that. And after that, I've booked aside some time that I'm going to adapt both Every Little Nookie and also Men Express Their Feelings into TV shows. Oh. So I'm definitely sort of planning on staying in theater as well. That's my kind of first love, but I'd also like to expand out into a new medium. I have, having said that, I finally carved out this time. I've been meaning to do this for years. I've been wanting to kind of start to expand to film and TV. And now that I've finally carved out the space, and I'm going to stick to that carving out, I've also got these kind of these theater pieces, percolating that I'm dying to write as well. But it's time to sit down and write some pilots. Sure.
Where can people find your work?
Well, my website is sunnydrake.com. So Sunny is spelt with a U, SUNNYDRAKE.com. And so I've got on my website, I have then that web series, Childish, that I was mentioning. You'll also be able to listen to Climate Change and Other Small Talk directly on the website, but it'll be on all the places where, you listen to podcasts too. And then there's links on my website too to where to find scripts and things as well. And I do all the social media, Instagram.
That was my next question.
Sunny_Drake at Instagram, and Facebook, Sunny Drake Productions.
Wonderful. Well, Sunny Drake, thanks for coming on the Playwright Spotlight.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Glad you enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Playwright Spotlight. Again, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below about your favorite part of this episode, and share this video with a friend. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. And in the meantime, and until we see each other again, keep writing.